In 1930, there were 4,000 peasant uprisings in Ukraine. More than 1,200,000 people rise up against the Soviet regime. Of course, this shatters the myth of a happy life in the USSR that Russia imposes. The real story shows otherwise. If it were not for the Soviet Union, there would definitely be more of us. And we would definitely live better. Today I want to talk about the terrible methods by which the Soviet Union consolidated its power in Ukraine. One of these methods was dekulakization, an attempt to destroy wealthy peasants. And this is just beyond the line of good and evil. My name is Akim Galimov, and this is Real History Channel. To understand the Bolsheviks' plan for the Ukrainian peasants, we need to go back to the time when Soviet power was established in Ukraine. So, in 1919, having captured most of Ukraine, the Bolsheviks announced the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was then that the Red Terror began. As a rule, the Bolsheviks conveyed their ideas to the people on posters with short slogans. Do you know what was written on them in 1919? With an iron hand, we will bring humanity to happiness. With an iron hand to happiness. What did this mean in practice? It meant mass executions by the Chekists of class enemies, their intelligentsia, priests, officers, and simply wealthy people. This was called the Red Terror. In Ukraine, more than 1.5 million people became victims of the Red Terror. Private property was outlawed. In the cities, the Bolsheviks took away factories and plants from their owners. In the villages, they nationalized the land and estates of landlords. Everything in the estates is robbed by activists. One of the Bolshevik leaders, Nikolai Bukharin, wrote, and I quote, "Coercion in all its forms, from executions to labor duty, is a method of forming communist mankind." This is such a horror. In 1919, peasants were forced into state farms and communes. There, they work for nothing to pay an extortionate tax to the city, which was called prodrazverstka. Trade union squads of city workers are sent to collect the tax. Posters with the words "peasants, give bread to the revolution" abound on the streets. But the Ukrainian peasants did not want to support the Bolsheviks and responded to the calls with sabotage and rebellion. In the summer of 1919, 328 of them took place. Famine broke out in the cities. Fearful of the unpredictable consequences, the Bolshevik regime decided to abandon the Red Terror and in 1921 announced a new economic policy. Private entrepreneurship is back. Now the posters have new inscriptions. Give the city a part of the harvest, dispose of the rest yourself. Peasants were allowed to rent land and hire workers. Thanks to these concessions, the Ukrainian SSR managed to overcome the economic crisis. 8 years later, the then dictator of the USSR, Joseph Stalin, decided that it was time to realize the main goals of the Bolsheviks to build socialism in his country, and to contribute to the victory of the World Revolution. In 1929, Stalin announced an advance of socialism on the entire front. In fact, he needed money. First, he wanted to turn an agrarian country into an industrialized one in a record time to show the world the benefits of socialism. Second, he needed money for the army. The Bolsheviks' main goal was the World Revolution. Accordingly, they wanted to impose their model of existence on the entire world through wars and weapons. They wanted to get the money for this through the sale of Ukrainian grain. Because before the advent of Soviet rule, Ukraine was the 8th largest grain exporter in the world. And Ukrainian communal farms were supposed to help the Bolsheviks realize their plan. At first, the Bolsheviks declared membership in the communal farms to be voluntary. Agitators traveled to villages and talked about the benefits of communal farming. But Ukrainian peasants immediately grasped the essence of the new organization: give your land and livestock to the communal farm. Work for free, and the state will take what you grow. Such prospects do not inspire anyone, and people avoid communal farms. In 1929, only 5% of the peasants signed up. And then the Soviet government came up with a plan. They needed to create an enemy for the peasants. This is how the Kurkul appeared. Who were the Kirkles? Remember, I said that in 1921 the government allowed peasants to rent land and even hire workers. So the most hard-working people managed to organize normal private farms during these 8 years, even though they paid huge taxes to the state. They grew grain and cattle, produced flour, cereals, dairy products, and meat products. The owners and their families worked from morning to night and often provided work and housing for several other hired workers and their families. Today we would call these people farmers. The only difference is that nowadays there are 1 or 2 farmers in the village, but back then almost every family had some kind of industrial tools and could feed and clothe themselves with them. In August 1929, the Council of People's Commissars of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, the equivalent of the current Cabinet of Ministers, adopted a resolution on the characteristics of Kirkle farms. If there is a mill, an oil mill, a cereal mill, a drying mill, or some other industrial tool, then it is definitely a Kirkle. These Kirkles are subjected to huge taxes, and cities are plastered with new posters with slogans. If we don't collect the tax, we will die of hunger. Meanwhile, Bolshevik propaganda began to sculpt a false image of the village, which would later be included in all Soviet history textbooks. Allegedly, the bulk of the peasants are not strong farmers, but the poor and middle class. They are mercilessly exploited by the Kirkle, so these peasants only sleep and dream of throwing off this Kirkle yoke from their necks. Caricaturists draw Kirkles alongside priests and petliurists very unattractive, fat, and evil. On posters, the Kirkles look like thieves and bandits, but with certain Ukrainian features, such as mustache and embroidery, and often in blue and yellow colors. Whereas good people, in the Bolshevik sense, proletarians and Chekists are depicted in urban clothes and Budanovka jackets. Peasants kick the Kirkles in the neck. Kirkles have no place in communal farms. Such posters appeared in Ukrainian towns and villages in the early 1930s. At the same time, the term dekulakization appeared in the press. Newspapers called the Kirkles the most numerous exploiting class and the last bastion of the restoration of capitalism. On January 30, 1930, in Moscow, the Politburo of the Central Committee of the CPSU adopted a resolution on measures to eliminate Kirkles' households in areas of continuous collectivization. The document was immediately classified. Its contents became known only 70 years later. The resolution divided the Kirkles into 3 groups. The first group included those who were to be shot or isolated in concentration camps. Those actively resisted collectivization and incited others. The second is those who had to be sent to remote areas of the USSR. Those did not actively resist grain procurement, but those did not want to join communal farms either. And the third group was those who were subject to compulsory resettlement outside the boundaries of the communal farms being created. At that time it was called forced dislocation. As a rule, these were non-mining lands, salt marshes, or forests. And just imagine, when people were relocated, they were not allowed to build their own homes. All they could do was dig a dugout or put up a small hut. This Bolshevik plan is for those who are suspected of disloyalty. Just think about it. A mere suspicion was enough to take away everything from a person and turn their life into hell. The order also contained numbers. Party members estimated that 60,000 Ukrainian peasants should be sent to concentration camps. Another 150,000 were to be deported to the north of the USSR. And this is without taking into account family members. The document did not specify how many should be killed. There were no explanations as to why exactly this number of peasants should be dekulakized. However, it was determined that the property of the repressed should be confiscated in favor of communal farms. It was planned to complete the entire special operation by April 15 of the same year, i.e. in 2.5 months. The leader of the Bolsheviks in Ukraine, Stanislav Kozha, was appointed in charge. Kozha was an ethnic Pole who joined the Bolsheviks from a young age, participated in the October coup, and then created underground Bolshevik organizations in Ukraine. Around 1925, he became a fanatical supporter of Stalin and began to move up the ranks. In 1928, Stalin appointed him to the highest Bolshevik position in Ukraine, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Bolsheviks of Ukraine. Here, this nondescript man of small stature organizes his own little cult. Portraits of Kozha hang on the walls of schools and factories. In his honor, the Kiev Radio Committee and many cults are named after him. Soviet newspapers daily glorify the activities of Comrade Kozha and quote him on every occasion. They also quote his statements about the Kirkles. A Kirkel should not be allowed to enter the communal farm even at a distance of a cannon shot. And the Kirkel seeks to strangle the Soviet government with the bony hand of hunger, but we will clamp this bony hand on his throat. In early February 1930, Chekist units were redeployed from Russia to Ukrainian networks. And with them were the so-called 25,000ers. These were military agitators who were supposed to form the necessary public opinion in the villages. That is, to convince people that the Kirkles are to blame for all the troubles, and if they're expelled, communal farm life will immediately go back to normal. The agitators, in fact, had to turn the residents against each other. The 25,000er, together with the Chekists, managed to speed up the creation of communal farms and form the so-called thugs. These were peasants who helped to carry out dekulakization. The peasants themselves were simply forced to join the communal farms. For example, during a meeting, they would close the door and keep people there until they wrote applications for membership. Or, if someone did not want to, they were locked up separately and could be beaten until the person signed the application. Those who were particularly reluctant were even arrested. On February 7, 1930, an order was sent to the regions. An operational order of the State Legal and Political Department of the Ukrainian SSR, the service of the NKVD, to organize an operation to massively evict the Kirkles element from the territory of Ukraine. It was a strict instruction on how and what to do. The Kirkles were to have everything taken away from them, and they were to be loaded into wagons and taken to Siberia. The deportees were allowed to take no more than 500 rubles per family and 2 months' worth of food. Each Ukrainian village has its own tragic stories of dekulakization. But they all have a lot in common. Usually the whole process began at night or early in the morning. People would be visited by aggressive neighbors, often drunk, accompanied by special SPD units. A dozen carts pull up to the yard. People are not even allowed to get dressed. Together with small children, the old, the bedridden, and the sick, they are driven out into the cold and the house begins to be robbed. If people try to save their property, they are humiliated and beaten. They also mock them in any way their imagination allows. There is evidence of Kirkles and their families being locked in cellars and basements naked, dipped in wells and ice holes, and being strapped with offensive posters on their backs and forced to carry activists on their shoulders. Not only men were abused. Women, the old, and even children were subjected to abuse. The activists were particularly merciless toward Kirkles' children. They were taken out naked in the cold, tied to poles, beaten, and demanded to tell them where their parents hid a bread. This horrific act was supposedly designed to re-educate the Kirkles. The process ended with an angry mob either destroying the Kirkles' house or one of the activists moving into the house. But there was another reaction to the Bolshevik terror. Mass resistance. Mass protests in Ukraine broke out in late February 1930. Immediately with the beginning of the brutal dekulakaizations. It all began on the territory of the modern Khmelnytsky region. From the Plahotniuk district, the uprising spread to almost the entire Shepetivka district. People shouted, "Don't touch the Kirkles! Down with collectivization! Down with the Soviet government! We will choose the headman!" In 22 villages, village councils were dispersed, activists and communists were beaten, and property was taken back from the communal farms. Then, with guns, hunting rifles, but mostly with axes and pitchforks, they went to the district center of Ritsev. On March 8, 1930, the peasants captured it. The Bolsheviks sent 2 units of cavalry regiments with machine guns, as well as border guards and police units to suppress the uprising. By March 13, the uprising was suppressed. Before they could extinguish the fire, another city caught fire. On March 14, Stanislav Kozha reported to Stalin that in 3 districts of the Tulchin district, almost all village officials had been dispersed, and that crowds led by Kirkles were threatening 3 district centers Bershad, Mestkov, and Vapnyaka. At the same time, peasants rose up in the Mohyliv and Vinnytsia districts. In total, the Soviet government was expelled from 73 villages there, and in the border district of Chervonopovstansky in the Odessa district, the peasants demanded, in addition to an end to dekulakization and the return of sown grain, the opening of the border. They approached the outpost, demanding its liquidation. In the village of Yaski, also in Odessa region, the rebels disarmed the police, dug up the village streets, set up barricades and built wire fences. Crowds of several hundred people sang "Ukraine has not died yet." The Bolsheviks and Komsomol members from this and several neighboring villages fled to the forest. Moscow was greatly frightened by the uprisings in 11 border districts. These included Chekists, police, armed communists, and cavalry. At the same time, along with all these forces, Stalin sends his henchmen to Ukraine. This is Georgy Ordzhonikidze, Commissar of the USSR Workers and Peasants Inspectorate. He was to personally assess the situation in Ukraine. In a letter to Stalin, Ordzhonikidze wrote, "In 3 districts, Tulchin, Shepativka, and Mohyliv, there is real uprisings of peasants. The uprising was suppressed with weapons, using machine guns, and, in some places, cannons. 100 people were killed and shot, and several hundred were wounded. These districts are predominantly with poor people. In other areas, there are similar uprisings. The reasons were hasty collectivization, the pursuit of interest, the communalization of chickens, the animalistic onslaught of seed collection, and the mockery of religion and the church. Ripping off roofs, floors, stoves, and more." In total, during the dekulakization campaign in 1930, the Bolsheviks deported almost 100,000 wealthy peasants with their families to Siberia. Stalin was afraid of such massive resistance from the peasants. The rebellious Ukraine not only did not produce grain, but could have destroyed the entire empire. So the dictator decided to calm people down a bit. In March, Pravda newspaper published his article "Dizziness from Success." In it, Stalin puts all the blame for the peasants' discontent on local officials. Allegedly, they had distorted the party line. The Tsar is good, and the boyars are bad, as always in Russia. Next, the Bolsheviks passed a decree that artificially created communal farms were to be dissolved. Within 100 days, from March 10th to June 20th, 1.5 million private households, or the half of all communal farms, were dissolved. And in autumn, during the sowing season, less than a third of the peasants, mostly the poor, remained in the communal farms. The forced retreat from collectivization under the pressure of Ukrainian peasants did not suit Stalin at all. He needed a lot of grain to feed the urban population and, most importantly, to provide for export. He planned to get the grain from fully controlled communal farms. After a short break in 1931, the Soviet government launched a new offensive against the peasants. This time, however, the special operation was carefully prepared for several months. In 6 months, the Kremlin plans to deport 200 to 300,000 Kirkle families from Ukraine to Siberia. And look how cynical the plan is. Lists for eviction should be drawn up by the Chekists together with village heads. The Kirkle is the worst enemy of the rural poor. Let's destroy the Kirkle as the class. Why aren't you in the communal farm yet? Those are main slogans on the posters of 1931. Political caricatures, pseudo-expository articles in the press, even children's stories were also part of the special operation. The public was supposed to believe that Kirkles were everywhere in the countryside, and that they were the ones who were harming the Soviet government in every way possible. Every village head in Ukraine received a letter clearly stating how many people should be dekulakized in their village. The archives contain a letter from one of the heads of Podillia villages who received orders for dekulakization. Things were terrible. There is a written order, common to all villages, to immediately allocate 15 to 20% of the Kirkles for deportation to Siberia. What can I do when I have such a poor village with not a single Kirkle in it? When I asked the authorities with this question, they told me that if I did not find 15% of the Kirkles, I would go to Siberia myself. Each of these people also has to invent and formulate a rather serious accusation, which none of them has ever heard or seen. It would be like killing these people. In March 1931, the Chekists began mass arrests. They called it the removal of counter-revolutionary elements from the village. In March alone, 19,000 peasants were arrested. In the summer, the government launched a deportation campaign. For this purpose, 69 trains were prepared in advance. The eviction lists were kept secret to prevent anyone from escaping. At night and early in the morning, the Chekists, together with tug teams, broke into houses and took people out. There is evidence that those who escaped were shot on the spot, regardless of whether they were men, women, or children. The Ukrainian peasants who were robbed and forced into communal farms barely survived the winter of 1931 to 1932. In most areas, people were actually starving. But even so, they still rose up against the Soviet regime. In the end, in order to somehow subdue the peasants and take revenge for these rebellions, the Stalinist authorities organized an artificial famine in Ukraine. The destruction of the Kirkles as the class was finally reported at the 12th Congress of Ukrainian Communists in 1934. They named a figure. Since the beginning of 1928, 200,000 Kirkle farms have been liquidated, all the ones that existed. There are other figures. The Encyclopedia of Ukraine states that between 1930 and 1932, 850,000 peasants were deported from Ukraine, mostly to Gulag concentration camps. We still do not know the exact number of people killed during dekulakization, protests, and torture in prisons. So when someone starts telling you about the most delicious Soviet ice cream again, just tell them these facts. Because this is the real story.